Chapter 41. The Heads. Being the largest city in the kingdom, First Town was home to some of the largest buildings that could be found anywhere in Froth. The largest of these buildings was the Great Temple, also known as the Great Chapel or the Temple of All. It sat on no fewer than 25 acres of land, and the building itself occupying 15 of those acres. By comparison, the King's Palace, sitting as it did on a mere 17 acres of land, was small. As expected, Reyes and Gaggara found the palace somewhere near the very centre of the city. Reyes had never seen the place before, but it would have been hard to mistake it. The building was a bright white. It seemed to gleam in the sunlight, as if the outer walls of the palace had been clad in marble. Somehow Reyes doubted it was marble. Marble was very expensive, hard to build with, and besides, there was a limestone quarry not all that far outside the city. Beautiful gardens, Gaggara said as she flew over the palace's outer walls. Reyes was surprised. Sometimes Gaggara would come up with comments like that, revealing that she had a softer, inner nature. She was a harpy, but she wasn't just some hunting, killing machine. She liked some of the finer things in life. There were times when her rough edges seemed almost superficial. Wonderful, he replied. Reyes followed Gaggara, letting her lead the way. This was her hunt. He glided effortlessly over the southern outer wall of the palace, following her, his eyes searching the ground for activity of any kind. There were soldiers down there. Reyes knew what colour the uniform of the King's Palace Guards was supposed to be from the books he had read, and from a description given to him by his sister when he was very young. He had never seen a palace guard for himself, but he was certain that the soldiers currently patrolling the palace grounds weren't them. If anything, the uniforms these soldiers wore were more in keeping with the sort of garb that elven soldiers would wear. Some of these guards did look up as Reyes and Gaggara flew over their heads, but not one of them shouted that the two harpies should leave the palace airspace, or indeed even gave them a second glance. Reyes also felt relieved to notice that not one of the soldiers he saw in the palace grounds seemed to be armed with a bow. Gaggara didn't seem to care about the soldiers. Her thoughts were on other things. Oh look! They even have a maze! Oh really? Reyes replied, glancing towards the hedgerow in question. A maze wasn't really all that much of a challenge when you had wings. Up ahead, on the rooftop of the palace, were 6 harpies. It had been cold earlier that morning, but now the sun had come out, and the harpies seemed to be making the most of it. Each of them was lying on her back on a flat part of the roof, wings unfurled to their fullest extent, catching as much sun as they could. Gaggara flew across the palace roof and over the heads of the sunbathing harpies. She circled the roof once, clearly looking for a suitable place to land, and then she came down to rest not all that far from one of the 6. Reyes held back a little until Gaggara had sorted out where she was going to land, and then he came in to land beside her. Reyes glanced around nervously, making sure he knew where all 6 of the sunbathing harpies were at all times, his instinct screaming at him that he was in danger just by being there. The nearest of the 6 sunbathing harpies suddenly sat up straight. She looked directly at Gaggara and then at Reyes. There was almost a challenging glint in her eyes. She climbed to her feet, returning her gaze to Gaggara, and then in a way that seemed totally out of character for a harpy, she folded her arms. As she did so, her face adopted a very stern expression. You can't be here. What? Reyes said out of surprise. The harpy had spoken flourish. Indeed, she had done so naturally that it took Reyes a moment or two to realise that he hadn't just imagined it. It put Reyes on his guard. Why would a harpy speak flourish to another harpy unless she was up to something? Reyes couldn't begin to guess at what this harpy might have in mind, but he was certain he wasn't going to fall for it. What did you say? The harpy looked straight at Reyes, tilting her head slightly to the side. Then she shook her head. I have no idea what you just said. What awful language is that? Could it be possible? Reyes wondered. Had they really met a harpy that couldn't even speak the harpy language? Gaggara stood beside him, laughing. She patted Reyes gently on the shoulder and commented, Let me handle this. Reyes looked at his ladylove, about to protest. He wanted to tell her that he was quite capable of communicating with his harpy. Then he thought better of it. Gaggara would probably be the better choice for talking with this rooftop harpy, thanks to the medallion. We're new in town, Gaggara explained. We were hoping to catch a glimpse of the human royal family. You wouldn't happen to know where they are, would you? The harpy laughed. Yes, I know where they are. She unfolded her arms and pointed towards the main gates of the palace grounds. Fly that way until you reach the wall of the palace, and you'll find what you're looking for in the street beyond. Whereabouts? Race asked, breaking into flourish before he could stop himself. The harpy barely seemed to notice what language he had spoken. Right there, on the street, she laughed. Go on, you'll find out what I mean. Oh, and one more thing. Yes? Gaggara asked. Don't come back inside the palace grounds, she said calmly. She settled back down on the rooftop with her sisters. Your kind isn't welcome here. Our kind? Race commented. The statement confused him. Weren't they all harpies? The girl who they had been talking to didn't offer any answer. She settled back down on the rooftop and began to sun herself once again. She didn't seem open to any further discussion. Gaggara didn't wait around. She oriented herself towards the gate and took flight. Race glanced back at the sunbathing harpy once more and considered chasing her up on exactly what she had meant. Then he realised that Gaggara had already left the roof of the building, and he had little choice except to follow her. Between the palace grounds and the buildings that sat opposite the main gates of the palace grounds was a nice, wide avenue. It had been purposely built to be wide enough so that people could come and admire the royal family on special occasions, such as the recent royal wedding. The actual road itself was of about the same size as any other road in the city, but there were wide paths on either side so that many hundreds of well-wishers could line the streets and cheer the royal coach as it drove by. As the harpy on the roof had said, this was where he would find the royal family of Flora. They were here, all right. At least, their heads were. There was a row of spikes leading along the avenue in both directions from the main gates of the palace. Atop each of these spikes sat the beheaded remains of a nobleman or noblewoman of the kingdom. Pride of place had been given to King Eristine and Queen Delina. Their heads sat on either side of the main palace gates. The king's head looked somehow fresher than the others. Blood had run down from the head over the upper third of the spike, suggesting to Race that the head must have been placed here shortly after the head had been removed from the king's neck. Of the others, only the queen's bled like that. Stuck to the king's spike, just below his head, was a small metal plaque. The plaque was clean despite the fact that it was near the top of the spike. Clearly it had been added an hour or two after the fact. The plaque was simple and to the point. Bear witness, here sits the King of Floreth. This is the fate of all those who dare raise a sword against the Dragon Emperor. This is his last resting place, here with every other noble in the land. Humanity, do not hope for liberation, for there is no one left to liberate you. Race couldn't help but look at the king's head for a few minutes. He had a kind of morbid curiosity. He had spent most of his early life wanting to see the king. Then on the day he was actually introduced, the king had sentenced him to death. Race had done nothing to deserve the sentence. He had committed no crime other than the one of not being born human. And even that was something he didn't realise he had done until Philide pointed it out to him. It was strange. Perhaps it was the harpy in him, but there was something mildly satisfying that the man who had tried to sentence Race to death was himself now dead. There was an added bonus to spending time looking at the king's dead head. Race feared that if he looked at the other heads, he would find Jenny among them. Until he found her, until he was certain that she was among the dead, he could pretend that she was still alive. He hated the idea that he was about to end his quest standing in front of the severed head of his sister, but in the end, he had to know if she was here. The spikes were scattered about 15 feet apart from each other. Race began to walk to the left of the king's spike. Sometimes he would need to be virtually on top of the next spike before he could be certain as to whether or not it was someone he knew. The spike to the left of the king contained the head of Princess Maribella. Race had only ever met her once back at his sister's engagement party. He hesitated there for a moment as he looked at her. For a human, Race had little doubt she had once looked very pretty, but now her face was contorted with fear. Race thought about his brother's dying words, and as little more than a whisper he said, "I guess you can tell her yourself now, brother." "What?" Gaggara commented, having followed Race. A line of dead heads was probably not all that interesting to her, but she stayed with him. "Nothing," Race replied. He glanced round and smiled at her. He was a lucky man. Next to Princess Maribella was Prince Tolf. Race recognised him only because he had seen him once before, in the courtyard of Castle de Moth, leaving the royal coach. Next to Prince Tolf was a small baby. The child could have been no more than 2 years old when he had been killed. These elves had shown no mercy. Not for the first time, Race wished he could express his emotion at the sight with tears. One of the side effects of having been brought up by humans was a desire to cry on occasion. Nor was it just the dukes and duchesses of the land along with their families, no matter how young their children might have been. There were spikes holding the advisors, mage advisors, and champion knights of nearly every nobleman in the land. Reyes had only met a few nobles in his time, and even then he didn't recognise them all as he saw them now. He recognised his grandfather, though. He was spiked about halfway along the line from the king. His head sat on a spike next to his daughter, Reyes' mother, and next to her was his father. Reyes shook his head sadly as he looked into the dead face of his father. He tried to remember the good times they had had together, the lessons in his father's study, the games of battle in the courtyard, which his father would invariably win. This was a man who had brought not just one, but 2 harpies into his household, despite the royal ruling against such actions, and had treated one of them so much like his own son that even that harpy hadn't realised the truth. Then, on that fateful day when the truth had finally come out, Reyes remembered how his father had arranged for him to escape from the castle, putting his own life at risk into the bargain. "Handsome?" Gaggara asked. "Just a minute," Reyes said. It was hard to pull himself away from the head of his mother and father, but he had to. He could sit there all day and think about the times they had had together, but that wouldn't bring his father back from the dead. He dragged himself away from his father and continued looking along the line of heads. When he reached the end, he returned to the palace gates and started walking the other way. There were fewer faces he recognised going this way, and it didn't take him as long to reach the end of the row. "She's not here," Reyes commented. Hope suddenly sprang into Reyes' heart. If she wasn't here, there was a good chance she was still alive somewhere. "You're sure?" Gaggara asked. "Not sure enough," Reyes admitted. Reyes began to move almost at a run back along the line of heads. He gave each one little more than a cursory look this time. He didn't want to find her, but he felt he needed to double-check every one of the heads to make absolutely sure. "She's not here," Reyes confirmed almost joyfully when he again reached the end of the line. "Well," Gaggara commented, "that's good, isn't it?" "It is," Reyes agreed. "I didn't see Prince Goatee either, and the country still has a king. I think they must both have gotten away before the others were massacred." "Is anyone else missing?" Gaggara asked. She walked up beside him and rested an arm on his shoulder. Reyes looked at her. "There could be. I don't know every noble in the land. I wasn't allowed to mingle that much." "Any idea where we might find them?" Gaggara asked him. "I have an idea," Reyes replied. "But you're the huntress. Where do you think they went?" Gaggara grinned at him and shook her head. "There are no clues here. Perhaps, if we were able to get inside the palace, I might find something that would help. Otherwise, I'm afraid the trail has gone cold. What about you? You said you might have an idea where they went." "I do," Reyes told her. He took to the air and hovered there until she came up to join him. "Follow me." He began to fly back towards the north of the city. "Where are we going?" Gaggara asked. She kept pace with him, but every so often she would glance over her shoulder in the general direction of the harbour. "Isn't it more likely that your sister would have been taken on board one of those ships?" "It's possible," Reyes admitted. "But I think it's unlikely. My sister would have been wearing a wedding gown. It seems unlikely there would be anyone in the city that wouldn't know who she was as soon as they saw her. There were probably a very few who wouldn't know Prince Goatee on sight either, and that goes for the elves as well. If she was captured and taken to the harbour, someone would have recognised her, and her head would now be decorating the outside of the palace with the others." "So, where are we going?" Gaggara asked. "Assuming Jenny and Prince Goatee fled the city together, there is pretty much only one direction they could have gone. North. If we follow the King's Highway back to the north, we will find the city of Lufton." "Lufton?" Gaggara commented uncertainly. "That's a fair way back to the north." "It's already beginning to get dark. Maybe we should wait until morning before we pick up the trail." Reyes thought about it for a minute and then shook his head. "This city is virtually empty. Even if we could find an inn to spend the night, I'm not sure I'd want to. I'd rather press on to Lufton tonight if we can. We can always camp out in the woods if we have to." "As you say, handsome," Gaggara accepted.